Shalom everyone, and welcome to our joint study of Parashat Yitro. This Parsha, obviously one of the most famous stories, Matan Torah, the revelation on Har Sinai, on mountain of Sinai, the Sinai mountain, and God gives us the 10 commandments, Aseret HaDibrot. Today, I would like to learn with you, to study with you, the last diber, the last statement, the last commandment, and to try to understand the ethical obligation as a reflection of the divine. And what do I mean by that? So take a look at the first source. The Torah states in Shmot, Exodus, chapter 20, verse 14, Lo tachmod beit re'echa. And I will just translate it now, Lo tachmod, you shall not covet. Beit re'echa, the house of your friend. Lo tachmod eshet re'echa, you should not covet your friend's wife. Ve'avdo, his servant, ve'amato, his maidservant, ve'shoro, ve'chamoro, his ox, his donkey, ve'chol asher le'erecha, and everything that belongs to your friend. Now, when you look at this psukim, when you look at this pasuk, and we will compare it in a minute or two to another pasuk, there are a few questions that definitely comes to mind. Question number one is, what's the definition of you shall not covet? What does that mean? It seems to be, just at first glance, that it's something that it's in your heart or in your mind. How can I look at someone, how can I look at something, and not to have a little bit of a feeling of, wow, I wish that I will have it. Not necessarily that I'm going to take it away from you, but just the feeling of, wow, this is so nice, I wish I would have it. So that's question number one. The second question that I'm not sure that we will deal with that today is the entire list. Lo tachmod, you shall not covet your friend's wife, his servant, his maidservant, his ox, his donkey, and everything that he has. That seems to be superfluous. Just say, Lo tachmod kol asher lerecha. You shall not covet everything that belongs to your friend. So why do we need to have a list? So we have two questions. Let's put them aside. Let's digress for a second. And let's see the second source. The second source is the other time that the Torah reflects the 10 commandments, which is in Sefer Dvarim, in the book of Deuteronomy, in Parashat Va'etchanan. So there in chapter 5, verse 18, it says, Velo tachmod eshet re'echa, and you shall not covet your friend's wife, which, if you remember, in our parsha, it starts with Lo tachmod beit re'echa, your friend's house. And then later on it talks about your friend's wife. So the first change is the sequence of what you shall not covet. That's A. B. Velo tit'ave beit re'echa. I will not translate yet tit'ave, but it says, you shall not tit'ave, whatever that means in a minute. The house, your friend's house, sadeu, his field, ve'avdo, his servant, ve'amato, his maidservant, shoro, his ox, ve'chamoro, his donkey, ve'chol asher lerecha, and everything that your friend has. So A, we see that obviously the sequence is different. The list is also a bit different because here, in this source, there is an additional item that you shall not covet, which is sadehu, his field, which was not mentioned in our parsha. And also, we are now being introduced to another commandment, which is velo tit'ave. Now, the word tit'ave maybe comes from the word ta'ava, desire. So if that's true, so this commandment basically says to us two things. You shall not covet, that we are not yet sure what exactly is the definition. And then we have an additional commandment which says, you shall not desire your friend's house, his field, his servant, his maidservant, his ox, his donkey, and everything that he has. So if I will try to sum up all our inquiries and questions and doubts, we basically do not understand what exactly God wants from us. What does it mean? All the other 10 commandments are somewhat simple. You need to believe in one God. You need to believe that God took you out of Egypt. You should not create any idols. You should respect your parents. You should keep the Shabbat. You shall not murder. You shall not steal. All of them are actions. But this last one seems to be that talks more about your emotions, your thoughts, your behavior. How do you define it? How exactly God expects us to do it? And what we will do today, we will try to see what our sages had to say about the definition itself of lo tachmod, that you shall not covet, and also to try to understand the idea behind it. So, the first source is a Tanaic Midrash. It's a Midrash that was composed in the time of the Tanaim, which is basically around 0 to the 2nd century, and CE, and Mechilta de Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, we all know, was one of the most famous Tanaim in the Talmud, and he says the following: Lo tachmod, you shall not covet. Ulehalan, and later on, which is in Deuteronomy, second time that the 10 commandments are being repeated with some changes, hu omer, lo tit'ave beit re'echa. So, it says there, and you shall not desire your friend's house. So the Mechilta, this Tanaic Midrash, immediately picks on what? On the change, on the deviation, and immediately asks the question, how do you reconcile the you shall not covet, and then later on you shall not desire? So, the way to reconcile this contradiction, the Mechilta says, lechayev al ta'ava bifnei atzma ve'al chemda bifnei atzma. So first, from a halachic perspective, from the Jewish law perspective, if someone coveted and also desired something, he will be punished on both. It's not one thing, it's not just semantics, it's two separate entities, two separate prohibitions. Okay, that's from the halachic, from the Jewish law perspective. But what's the definition? So now take a look. Eizo hi ta'ava. What does it mean? What is the definition of lo tit'ave, that you shall not desire? Haomer lu she, which means I wish that I will. Which means the desire is, I look at you and I say, oh wow, you have a beautiful tie. I wish I will have this tie. That's desire. What is chemda? What does it mean? You shall not covet. Hakovesh kibushin litlan. What does that mean? Coveting is already conspiring to take something that does not belong to me. I'm not stealing yet. It's all in my mind, or maybe in my heart. I look at something that you have, and I'm already start figuring out how can I get it from you. So, let's take a step back for a second. Lo tachmod, you shall not covet, means like second step, which is looking at something, desiring it, and now planning of how can I get it. Yet, not doing anything. It's all in the stage of the preparation. And lo titave, you shall not desire, it's the first feeling of that I wish I will have something that you have. Both stages, you shall not desire, you shall not covet, is part of the 10 commandments. So if we stop here for just a second and we think about God's expectation from us, it seems to be that it's almost impossible. Think about it. We see something nice that our friend has, and let's talk about the first stage. Basically, according to that commandment and this interpretation, you cannot even look at that and say, oh wow, I wish I would have it. This is a very hard commandment. Besides the fact that sometimes it seems to be that you can't help it. You look at something beautiful, aesthetics, and it's something really nice, and you say, I wish I would have it. Not necessarily that I'm going to plan now how am I going to take it from you. So what is the idea of such an expectation? So let's move forward. The Rambam, Maimonides, in Hilchot Gzeila ve'Aveda, in the laws of thievery and stealing and lost objects, says the following: Hata'ava, the desire, mevi'a liidei chimud. It causes you to conspire to get something that it's not yours. So what? Ve'achimud mevi liidei gezel. So, and coveting will lead you to steal something, which means, according to the Rambam, we have a three-tier commandment. Lo titaveh, you shall not desire, because if you will start desiring something, it will lead you to coveting, which means start planning, conspiring of how can I get it. And then this plan is not going to just stay in theory, you're going to implement it, you're going to steal. Which means, lo titaveh is the preparation for not to get to stealing. שאם לא רצו הבעלים למכור, אף על פי שהרבה להם בדמים והפציר ברעים, because if you look at something that your friend has and you say, oh wow, I wish I would have it, can you please sell it to me? And your friend says, I'm not interested, I'm just not selling. You will be upset because you desire it, and therefore you will steal it from your friend. שנאמר וחמדו בתים וגזלו. And then he continues. And he says, ואם עמדו הבעלים בפניו להציל ממונם או מנעו מלגזול, and if the owners of that object that you want will stand against you and say, no, I'm not giving it to you, I'm sorry, יבוא לידי שפיכות דמים. It will cause you to shed blood, to murder the guy. צא ולמד ממעשה אחאב ונבות. And if you think, says the Rambam, that I exaggerate, look at Tanakh. In the Tanakh, there is a story that exactly describes what I told you. Okay, before we get into the story in the Tanakh, and before we go anywhere that the Rambam is trying to guide us, let's just try to understand what the Rambam says. First and foremost, it seems to be that the commandment, you shall not covet, or you shall not desire, it's really not so much of an independent commandment. It's just like almost like a fence, a deterrent. Don't desire something that does not belong to you. You know why? Because it will lead you to coveting, to planning, to conspiring. How am I going to want to get it? And then it will lead you to an action, to stealing. And if the owner of the object is going to stand up against you, it might lead you to murder him. So this is why you shall not desire anything that does not belong to you. So that's the definition. Now you would say, this is a bit of overboard. This is like, how many times we see something and we say, wow, this is beautiful, I wish I would have it, but you're not going to kill the person and try to get the object. He says it might, but it also might not, which means sometimes it can lead you to that horrific sin of murdering. And what's the story that the Rambam brings as an example? Achab and Navot. And I will share with you the story. Achab was the king of Israel. And he was not the most righteous king. He did a lot of good things for the Jewish people politically, but he was not exactly what we will call, a righteous king. Then one day, he was walking around his palace, and he saw a beautiful garden. He looked around and he asked, who is the owner of that garden? And he was told it was Navot. So he sends some messengers to Navot, and he says to him, I really like your garden. And don't forget, I'm the king of Israel. but you know what? I would love to pay you. Just name the price and I'll give you the money and just give me your garden. And Navot says to him, my king, I'm not selling it. I'm sorry. It's an inheritance for my parents, for my grandparents, and I'm not interested in selling. So when the Jewish king, when Achav heard about it, he was very upset. And he didn't eat, he didn't drink, he didn't sleep. His wife, Jezebel, says to him, my dear husband, what's going on with you? Can you please tell me what's going on? So he told her the story. So Jezebel says to him, my dear husband, you are so weak. You are not a king. I'll show you how you get this garden. So what does she do? She sends 2 witnesses. She pays them. They testify against Navot that he did something horrible. They kill him. They execute Navot. And then Achav can have the garden. Eliyahu, the prophet, goes to Achav and says to him one of the most famous statements in the Bible. Haratzachta gam yarashta? You murdered Navot, and you have the chutzpah not only to murder him, but also to inherit his garden? And then Elijah gives him a rebuke and a punishment and all of it. But what's the point of the story? How did that story begin? Says the Rambam, desire. Navot desired the field, coveted it, wanted to quote unquote steal it. At the end of the day, Navot was murdered because of Achav. You can tell me, it's only one example. Maybe that's an exception. Says the Rambam, perhaps it's not an exception. Maybe most people will not do it, but for the people who will, this is why we have a commandment like that. So it seems to be that according to the Rambam, according to Maimonides, this entire commandment is a fence to guard you from doing things that you will be really sorry about. So that's the Rambam. Now, let's go to Philo. Philo in Alexandria, in Egypt, in the 1st century, was a thinker, a philosopher, and he suggested the following explanation for our commandment, לא תחמוד. לבסוף, אוסר הוא לחמוד. He says the last commandment is that you shall not covet. ביודעו, because he knew, כי ממרא החימוד וחורש רעה. He says because chimud, coveting, is basically destroying your heart. It's playing with your heart. הרי כל ההתפעלויות הנפש קשות, שמטלטלות הן ומזעזעות אותה בניגוד לטבע, ואינן מניחות לה להיות בריאה, אך קשה מכולן החימוד. He says, and he gives us a little bit of I will call it a 101 psychology lesson. He says, our nefesh, our soul, is obviously influenced from different things in the world. But more, it's influenced heavily by inner feelings. He says, the chimud, coveting, is an inner feeling. שכן, because כל התפעלות אחרת הבאה מבחוץ אינה כפי הנראה מרצוננו. ואילו החימוד לבדו ראשיתו בתוכנו ומרצוננו הוא. He says, you need to distinguish between 2 types of influences. There is an external influence, and then there is an internal influence. External influences, let's say you are walking somewhere and you saw something frightening, so that was an external influence. Now you are a little bit afraid, but it was from the outside, it was external to you. However, chimud starts with me. I decided that I would love to have what you have. It's in me. It's a fire in my bones. I want it. Says Philo, that's 1st century. He says, בשעה שנתן אדם אל ליבו טובה שאינה נוכחת ושואף לזכות בה, says, when I covet something that I don't have, and I'm now becoming obsessed with it, because we know sometimes things that you don't have, that's exactly what you want. הוא דוחף את נפשו למרחקים ומותך עד מאוד מתוך כמיהה לגעת בטובה הנחשפת. He says you start using your imagination and you become obsessed with not only that I wish I would have what you have, is that I desire it, I want it, I'm obsessed with it, I will not stop until I get it. להוט לתופסה, אך אינו מסוגל להגיע אליה. Now, I desire what you have, but it belongs to you. I can't get it. So it basically pushes me even further to be more obsessed with it. ומצבו כשל הרודף אחרי הנסוג מפניו במהירות קטנה משל הבורח, אך במהירות שלא ינוצח. Which means it's like running, chasing after someone who you chase him and you think that you can get it, but then he takes one step before you. And you will never be able to catch him. Philo is describing something which is fascinating. He looks at this commandment, לא תחמוד, that you shall not covet, not from the halachic perspective, which means like what the Rambam, my Maimonides, tried to do, or the Mechilta, the Tanaic Midrash that we saw before. Philo looks at this commandment as a fundamental commandment which can destroy who we are as humans. Basically, according to Philo, after the Torah specify all the other 9 commandments, which are dealing with emunah, faith in God, not worshipping idols, respecting our parents, keeping the Shabbat, will not murder, shall not steal, all of those beautiful things. Then Philo says, God has something to say about the psyche of our humanity and the psyche or the idea of who we are and what can we be if we are not careful. You can have all the beautiful commandments, but if you desire or coveting something that does not belong to you, and you start by looking at that and become obsessed with it, it will ruin who you are. And I don't know, I don't want to compare it to Greek tragedies, but in many of those Greek tragedies, someone is obsessed with something, there is some kind of a prophecy, he is obsessed with it and he's ruining himself and everyone around him. Philo, in a way, suggests the same thing here. Don't put yourself in a situation that you covet something because psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, humanly, you're going to lose your identity and you will be obsessed with something that you will never achieve. I think this idea of what Philo suggests, I think it's very creative, and B, I think it gives us little bit the idea behind this commandment, which we saw how we struggle to try to define. Because basically we understand that there is a punishment for an action or inaction. Here it's not an action. What Philo says, it's more than an action. It's a way of life. It's the way you think about things. It's a way you appreciate someone else's belongings, which means they are not yours. It also teaches us about איזהו עשיר השמח בחלקו, who is wealthy, who is happy, someone who is happy in his lot, and not looking at things that you don't have, but rather to think about things that you do have. So that's Philo. Much later on, around the 11th century, 12th century, Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra. And Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra also suggests an interesting insight into this very enigmatic commandment of lo tachmod, that you shall not covet. So let's learn it together. Lo tachmod, you shall not covet. Anashim rabim itmehu al zot hamitzvah. This is a very interesting, very much of an open reflection of, I will call it, being intellectual, to have some kind of intellectual honesty, which means he looks in one of those commandments and he says, look, I'm well aware, many people are asking the same question. איך יהיה אדם שלא יחמוד, דבר יפה בליבו, כל מה שהוא נחמד למראה עיניו. It says, many people look at this mitzvah, look at this commandment and ask themselves, how can someone ask me to avoid doing something which is so natural? You look at something nice and you say, I wish I will have it. Not necessarily I wish I would have it and you shouldn't. Or not necessarily I wish I should have it and I'm going to steal it from you. Just even the thought that I wish I should have it, it's not good. How can you have such a commandment? I think it shows tremendous honesty. But now he's going to give us a way to think about this commandment. And he says the following. Ve'ata, and now, אתן לך משל. I will give you a parable to try to explain to you how come that God can ask us to do something like that. Da, you should know. And now we start with the parable. כי איש כפרי, שיש לו דעת נכונה, let's say, a village man, a farmer in the village. And he is smart, he is wise, he is a decent man. והוא ראה בת מלך שהיא יפה. And he saw a princess, beautiful princess. She is the daughter of the king. לא יחמוד אותה בליבו שישכב עמה, כי ידע כי זה לא ייתכן. He says this farmer, he can look at this princess, and she's beautiful, she's gorgeous. But this farmer will look at her, and it will never cross his mind that he can marry her and be with her. Why? כי ידע כי זה לא ייתכן. Because he knew it will never happen. And because you know that it will never happen, says the Ibn Ezra, the thought of maybe should not even cross your mind. Now, don't forget, we are talking about 11th, 12th century. The ma'amadot, the levels, in the elite group of society and the very much not elite group of society, they didn't mix. So it really fits to the 11th, 12th century. Today it might be a little different, but let's just try to follow what he had to say. ואל תחשוב זה הכפרי שהוא כאחד מן המשוגעים, שיתאבש יהיה לו כנפיים לעוף השמיים ולא ייתכן להיות. כאשר אין אדם מתאבד לשכב עם אמו, אף על פי שהיא יפה, כי הרגילו מנעוריו לדעת שהיא אסורה לו. And he says, I will explain it to you. No one, when you look at a bird, you see a bird flying. No one in his right mind will say, I wish I would have wings and I can fly. Why? Because you know it's impossible. You can go on a plane, you can go on a spaceship, but you cannot have wings and start flying. If someone has a beautiful relative, he's not going to marry her because he knows it's prohibited. ככה כל משכיל צריך שידע. Therefore, everyone who has sechel, everyone who has sense, needs to know כי אישה יפה, that a beautiful woman, who is not your wife, או ממון, or a monetary object, לא ימצאנו אדם בעבור חוכמתו ודעתו, רק כאשר חלק לו השם. So you need to know that whatever you have, this is what you have. Whatever your friend has, this is his, it's not yours. And therefore, when you look at it, it should not even be attractive. I'll deal with that in a few minutes. ואמר קהלת, and that's what the wisest person on earth, שלמה המלך, King Solomon says, ולאדם שלא עמל בו יתננו חלקו, ואמרו חכמים, בני חי ומזון אליו, בזכות הטליה מילתא, אלא במזלה. And our sages said in many places in the Talmud, the children living, which means parnasa, sustenance, money, and mezoni, and food, it's not because of who you are, but it's more depends on a mazal, on your luck. ובעבור זה המשכיל לא יתאווה ולא יחמוד. And therefore, if you understand it, you will not covet and you will not desire someone that does not belong to you. ואחר שידע שאשת רעהו אסרה השם לו, and after you know that your friend's wife is prohibited on you, you cannot be with her, יותר היא נשגבה בעיניו מבת מלך בלב הכפרי. So it's even more than the village man, the farmer. He looks at the princess and he knows it will never happen, so he never think about her. So when you know that God told you that you cannot be with your friend's wife, you cannot have your friend's belongings, so the prohibition itself is much stronger than just this farmer and this princess, and therefore because you know it's prohibited on you, so the thought to have it should not even cross your mind. על כן, therefore, הוא ישמח בחלקו, he will be happy with his lot, ועל ישים אל ליבו לחמוד ולהתאבות דבר שאינו שלו. And therefore, it will lead you to avoiding even the thought about, oh, I wish I would have something that I don't have, because you know that you will never get it. כי ידע שהשם לא רצה לתת לו. Because you would know that Hashem didn't want to give it to you, he gave it to your friend. לא יוכל לקחתו בכוחו ובמחשבותיו ותחבולותיו, and you will never be able to get it. על כן יבטח בבוראו שיכלכלנו ויעשה הטוב בעיניו. And therefore, you will trust God that he will do the right by you and he will give you whatever you need. Okay. I would say it sounds great. However, is that practical? Can we implement it? Now, we know that sometimes we have an ideal and then there is the reality. But let's think about what the Ibn Ezra says, because I think it's very, very important and also very deep. And perhaps it's hard for us to fathom and to comprehend such an idea, but it's something that we need to think about. Basically, he says, something that is prohibited, we should not even have the thought to do or to take. That's A. B, there is a tremendous expectation of emunah, of faith, that whatever I have, that's what God wants to give me. If God wanted to give me someone else's wife or someone else's belongings, I would have it. The fact that I don't means I don't, and I will never get it. Now, to the 21st century ear, it sounds very much of a person with zero ambition. Now, I'm not talking about your friend's wife, but let's say your friend's belonging. If you look at someone else's belonging and you say, why, I wish I would have his tie or car or house, and then you go ahead and you work hard and you get the same house or the same car, we'll look at that as ambition. The Ibn Ezra look at that as a waste of your time and something that you don't really have trust in God that he gives you what you need. Now, I think his commentary, and I purposely brought it because of its complexity and because of its, I think maybe because it's so exceptional. It's something that as modern people, we don't really think about it and we don't think like that. The Ibn Ezra basically says, this desire for something else that your friends has basically shows a lack of trust in God and that your perspective on your life is skewed. This is a very interesting commentary that I would like all of us to think about it. It's not a simple thought, especially to the 21st century people, but in a way, if we want to think a little bit out of the box, and we think a little bit about what is a need versus a want, I think the Ibn Ezra can give us some guiding. Sometimes I think the Ibn Ezra, and maybe that's what Philo in the first century already tried to convey to us, a desire for something that does not belong to you. It's basically can lead you to lack of clarity of what you need and what you want. And how much time do we spend trying to get what we think we need, but it's really what we want and not necessarily need. So I will stop here with the Ibn Ezra, and I will leave it to you to think about it and to see, can we somehow incorporate the Ibn Ezra in our lives? A bit complicated, but definitely I think deserve our attention. So now, let's move to the 19th century. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, in his commentary on Chumash, also looked at the commandment of lo tachmod, velo tit'aveh, you shall not covet and you shall not desire. And he looked at it from a totally different perspective. דווקא איסור זה, שלא תחמוד ולא תתאווה, he says, דווקא, specifically, this last commandment, not the most famous one. If I would ask you, what is one of the most famous commandments, you will say, כבד את אביך ואת אמך, you shall respect your parents, or אנוכי השם אלוקיך, I am Hashem your God, or לא תרצח, you shall not murder. לא תתאווה ולא תחמוד is like the last one, not that important. Says Rab Shimshon Raphael Hirsch exactly the opposite. הוא המטביע את חותם השם על החלק החברתי של 10 הדיברות. He says that the commandment about you shall not covet, this is the signature, this is the divine signature on the social aspect of the 10 commandments. Because if you remember the 10 commandments, the first tablet is more about between you and God. The last one, respect your parents, is some kind of a bridge. And then you have 5 commandments that talks about what? The social aspect of how to build an ethical society. Starting, we shall not murder, you shall not steal. So the last one is, you shall not covet. גם מחוקק בשר ודם יכול לגזור לא תרצח וכן הלאה. אך רק השם יכול לגזור לא תחמוד. He says, the last commandment proves that the 10 commandments were all given by God. Why? He says every judge, every king can come up with the idea you shall not murder. And we all understand it. No society can really perform and can be sustained if murder will be allowed. It will be a chaos. But he says only God can command you, you shall not covet. Why? הוא לבדו בוחן כליות ולב, לפניו גלויים לא רק המעשים, אלא גם המחשבות והרגשות. He says God, unlike any other king or ruler or a prime minister or a president, he knows your heart. He knows your thoughts. And therefore, he can command us. He can give us commandments relates to our thoughts and our feelings. אם נתבונן בסדר, בו נאמרו עקרונות בסיסיים אלו, נמצא בו אמת המאירה באור חדש את כל התפיסה של תורת השם. He says if we're going to look at those fundamentals, those basic fundamentals, we will see a true light on the entire Torah, which means, החלק הראשון, the first stage of the 10 commandments, מתחיל, starts with, אנוכי. הוא מסתיים בכבד את אביך ואת אמך. So the first 5 commandments starts with, I am Hashem your God, I took you out from Egypt, and it ends with what? Respect your parents. החלק השני, the second part of the 10 commandments, starts with לא תרצח, you shall not murder, and ends with לא תחמוד. חובת ההכרה בהשם פותחת בדרישה המופנית עד השכל. He says, the first part starts with what? With the demand, recognize God. Believe in God. And it all relates to your cognitive ability. You need to recognize, you need to internalize the idea that God is your God and he took you out from Egypt. אך אין די בהכרה השכלית בהשם. But it's not enough that cognitively I believe in God. אנו חייבים לבטא את הכרתנו בהשם גם במעשה. We must express our cognitive abilities in an action. And therefore, we have what? לא תישא זכור וכבד, which means we need to control our speaking abilities. לא תישא, you should not mention God's name in vain. Then, with our job, with our work, that's when you keep Shabbat. You show that you believe that God is your God. ועל חיי משפחתנו, and our family lives. Respect your parents, and then your children respect you. So the first part is recognizing cognitively God is your God, and then reflect it through your dibur, your speaking, your actions, and your family. החקיקה החברתית, but then the social aspect of how you build a Jewish, an Israeli society starts with what? With תביעות על מעשינו ודיבורנו. So it starts with what? With the way we speak and the way we act. לא תרצח, לא תנאף, לא תגנוב, לא תענה. So speaking, talking, doing, and then what? לא תחמוד. And then it ends with what? With your thoughts. Take a look at what Rabbi Shimshon Raphael here says. לא תחמוד, you shall not covet. In a way, it's the most difficult commandment. Because cognitively, I can understand, I can believe in God, I can understand that society needs to be built with you shall not murder and you shall not steal. But then God asks you something that only the divine can ask us. I also ask you to please control your thoughts. Because even though it's the last commandment, that's where everything starts. The way you think about things, the way you feel about things, many times will lead us to the way we speak and the way we act. Says Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, the last commandment, which ends the social aspect of the 10 commandments, that it's obviously related to what? To the divine expectations from us to believe in Him and not to worship idols. All together, at the end of the day, boils down to the beginning and the end, which is our thoughts. So this little commandment, לא תחמוד, in a way, as Rabbi Shimshon Raphael here says, מטביע את חותם השם על החלק החברתי של 10 הדיברות. It's basically signed, it's basically created this divine signature at the end of the 10 commandments telling us God is expecting us not only not to murder someone, not to steal from someone, but also to think positively, to think in a way that does not create any damage to you and to others. So Parashat Yitro, the 10 Commandments, does not speak only about our relationship with God and the revelation on Sinai, but it really talks a lot about our relationship with the others and our relationship with ourselves. So next time, when we see something beautiful, we can say, wow, it's beautiful, but we shouldn't think, I wish I would have it. However, we also need to understand that it's an ideal that it's hard to accomplish. So we have a long way to go and accomplish what Rabbi Shimshon Raphael here says, the recognition of our divine expectation to create a society that is happy for what others have, happy with what we have, and creating a real Am Yisrael. Thank you.